How is it possible that one of the darkest, most oppressive periods in all of Jewish history was also one of the most creative? For more than 1,000 years, from around 500 CE until the start of the European Enlightenment in the late 18th century, virtually all Jews in the world lived as second-class citizens, or worse, in lands ruled by either Christianity or Islam. These are the Jewish Middle Ages, what's commonly called the time under Crescent and Cross. And yet, during this time of great insecurity, our ancestors produced some of Judaism's most sublime poetry, commentary, philosophy, as well as tremendous works of legal and mystical thought. It's true that at certain moments, Jews indeed fared pretty well, particularly under the tolerant Muslim rulers of places like Baghdad, Cairo, and Spain. During these golden ages, some Jews achieved near equality with their Muslim neighbors and reached the highest levels of society. But for most of the Middle Ages, particularly for Jews living under the rule of the medieval church, this was a period of terrible persecution. Jewish communities were held collectively accountable for the death of Jesus and were labeled Christ killers, and lived under the constant threat of massacres and mass expulsions. Over several hundred years, Jews would be expelled from every country in Western Europe, leading to mass migrations eastward toward the Polish and Russian frontier in hopes of a somewhat freer life. In spite of all this, the Middle Ages were a time of tremendous intellectual and spiritual creativity for the Jewish people. It was, for example, the golden age of commentary. During these centuries, scholars across the Jewish world wrote running commentaries on the Bible and the Talmud, uncovering new layers of interpretation in these foundational works and redefining what it means to study a sacred text. The greatest of these writers was Rashi, who lived in France in the 11th century and whose biblical and Talmudic commentary is considered an essential companion of every serious student of Judaism. While he's still the best known, he was joined in this effort by scores of others living in Spain, Germany, Italy, and North Africa. One of my favorite sets of books on my shelf is called Mikraot Gedolot. It's a classic printing of the Torah, in which each page only has a verse or two, and then is surrounded by dozens of commentaries from this era, each one questioning and dissecting and reimagining even the smallest snippet of biblical text. In the hands of the medieval commentators, study becomes a symphony, in which voices across continents and centuries enter into conversation with one another in a shared quest for understanding. Don't be surprised if you attend a Torah study session and an hour later you've only read a few sentences or maybe even only a few words. I know of one group that's been studying Torah together weekly for 16 years and is just now getting to the book of Deuteronomy. That's possible because of this commentary tradition that teaches us to see every word as a diamond, with 100 possible facets and faces to explore. In addition to commentary, the Middle Ages also give birth to Jewish philosophy, with such intellectual giants as Saadia Gaon, Judah Halevi, and Maimonides, attempting to bring Torah into conversation with Greek wisdom and with the science of their day. Maimonides, also known as the Rambam, may be the greatest genius in all of Jewish history. During the week, he was the personal physician to Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt. On Shabbat, he served as the rabbi of Cairo's Jewish community, one of the biggest and most vibrant of its time. And amazingly, he still found time to write the most important works of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, and philosophy, the Guide for the Perplexed, ever written. Maimonides' Guide is an 800-year-old book asking an extraordinarily modern question. If one has a university education and exposure to the best of science and philosophy, do they really still need religion? In the pages of the guide, Maimonides says profound and scandalous things. He wrote that much of what the Torah says, particularly about God, is a metaphor rather than being meant to be taken literally. He said that science and faith are not enemies, but are both essential paths to discovering the truth, and that even the most devoutly religious person who rejects science cuts themselves off from ever truly understanding God. He said that the purpose of the mitzvot is not just to teach us to humbly submit to the will of heaven, but to develop our character and maybe achieve enlightenment. In addition to Maimonides, this was an era of great Jewish legal scholars, the most famous of which was Joseph Caro, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, the most authoritative code of Jewish law ever set down. It was also an age of Jewish poetry. Many of the most beloved prayers and songs of Shabbat and Passover and the High Holy Days were composed by paitanim, scholar poets, who wrote beautiful liturgical verse. Not all the poetry from this time, though, was so religious. Hebrew poets of this era also tried their hand at writing poetry about nature, romantic love, and all sorts of other secular themes. Along with all these commentaries, poems, and works of law and philosophy, the Middle Ages saw the flowering of Jewish mystical study, what's known as Kabbalah. All mystics, whether Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or Jewish, seek clues within their traditions to gain access to hidden wisdom and to try to get a direct experience of the divine. The most famous Kabbalistic text, the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, was published in Spain in the 13th century. It seeks to reveal the symbolic meaning of many seemingly familiar stories and laws from the Torah. In the hands of the mystics, the words of our classic texts become like a code, which, given the proper key, reveals treasure troves of otherwise inaccessible insight. The Zohar itself explains it best. It says, "How sad for a person who regards the Torah as a book of mere tales and everyday matters. If this was so, even we could write a better book." The Torah, however, contains in all its words higher truths and sublime mysteries. Her stories are only her outer garments. A person's clothing is only their outermost layer. Only a fool would look at a person and not realize that their true self is concealed beneath their clothes. So too the Torah has a body and a soul that are hidden in garments of worldly narrations. Just as the Zohar pushed the limits of what we understand the Torah to be, other mystically minded communities, like the one found in Sfat in the north of Israel in the 16th century, or among the founders of Hasidic Judaism in Ukraine and Poland in the 18th century, produced some of the wildest, most daring, imaginative, and profound Jewish teachings ever conceived. What moves me so deeply is that all of this religious creativity, the writings of Rashi and Maimonides, of legal scholars and poets, of the mystics of Kabbalah, all took place against a backdrop of persecution, displacement, and worse. I take it as a source of great inspiration that no matter how tough times get, the beautiful light of the human spirit can cut through even the deepest dark. Like a clear night sky illuminated by starlight that started its journey toward us eons ago. The light that these ancestors passed down to us through their remarkable words continues to light a path for us today.
Yay, nay,